And the cost of having all the cows on the pasture will be shared by all the farmers. But then if one farmer decides to put more cows, because, for example, he needs to have more revenue and more meat produced, you will go over the tipping point and over the carrying capacity of the pasture. And this will actually just ruin the resource for everyone. And so the benefit will be very high for the farmer that will just increase its own cattle, but the cost will be the ultimate cost. In the beginning, the cost will be shared by everyone, but in the end, the cost will be tragic for everyone because the pasture will just go completely dead. And so this is exactly how Garrett Hardin, which was an American ecologist, formalized this tragedy of the common in a very famous article in 1968. In this article, Garrett Hardin was trying to solve what he called the population problem, the fact that we have a growing population on Earth with finite resources. So it's a topic of actuality, with climate change and all this stuff. A lot of those concepts and theoretical work has popped up again in the literature. And back in those days, this idea of tragedy of the commons was really more in terms of economics and politics. It was defined as a situation where everyone has free access to a resource that is limited in quantity, and where the individual interests and the collective good are optimized by different strategies that are in conflict with each other. And it really emerged as an opposition to the economic concept of the invisible end that maybe you also heard of by Adam Smith, a very famous economist. And so the view of Adam Smith was exactly the opposite view of Garrett Hardin. So Adam Smith, for him, if the individual in a group try to maximize their own benefit at the individual level, if all individuals do that, it will generally improve the collective benefit. So this is what you can read here on the cover of the book. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the bakers that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. So what it meant is that if each individual tries to maximize its interest, you're going to benefit from it at the collective level. And Garrett Hardin just tried to balance this view and say that for some problem in some situation, actually it's the opposite. If the individual try to maximize their individual interest, you're going to have a high risk of population crash, actually. And so it shows the word tragedy, not only because the outcome is sad, because in this case, for example, the population decline or the pasture just go dead. He used the word tragedy because there is something that is very hard to avoid. So this is a citation that he used in the paper. The essence of tragedy is not unhappiness. It resides in the solemnity of remorseless working of things, which means that the thing that is very sad is that you cannot escape from this evolutionary trajectory. It's very hard to escape from this because especially us humans, we cannot really consider the fact that if we overuse the resources, we do not see immediately the cost for everyone. We tend to focus on our immediate benefit, and it's really hard to not focus on these immediate benefits and immediately think about the overall cost for everyone. And so there are multiple examples of tragedy of the commons in our societies that are studied by ecologists, economists, or people working in environment management. And one famous example that you might have heard of is fishing. So you know that we have the oceans can be considered as a common where all the countries can go and fish in the sea as they want. So of course there is some regulation, but in some part of the world and back in some days there was no regulation. And of course, the optimal use of the oceans would be that every country just fish the right amount for its own interest, but not overpassing the capacity of the fishes to renew the stocks. But we know that for many fishes, there was some extinction of some fish species due to overfishing because, again, the countries try to maximize their individual benefits. But it's not only the case for stuff that are directly measurable, like the number of fish, for example. It's also the case for tourism, for example. If you go to a national park or a very famous building, actually there is the tragedy of the common is also there, because the values that the people seek when they go to those places, it actually decreases when the number of individuals that go to those places increases. So the more individual goes to, for example, a very famous antique site here, the more the antique site gets degraded, and it's inevitable. And so then the values that the people seek when they go there decreases over time. And so this is also an example, a very famous example of tragedy of the common. Another one that you might just have experienced is a traffic jam. When you are stuck in your car and there is a lot of car on the road, very often the traffic jam just gets worse because individuals try to overpass everyone and to change lines and to go faster and to take shortcuts, and this actually increases the amount of traffic jam. And this is also, again, a case of tragedy of the common, because you have this conflict between the individual interest and the collective good. And this is why sometimes the best way to prevent those traffic jam is just before the traffic jam to impose some speed limitation. And so if everyone starts running a bit more slowly, you can avoid a lot of traffic jams just by limiting the speed in before. Another case is not by taking up some resources from the environment, but rejecting stuff in the environment. So if you think about a river, different plants, for example, or industry sites just dump their waste in the water, the cost for the individual industry is very low to just dump the waste in the local area, and it will get diluted over the course of the river. But if you have many plants that do the same, of course, the river gets polluted. And this example is also discussed by Hardin in his article. So you have this article, I don't know if I said it already, but you have this article from Hardin attached to the course material in Moodle. So you can download and read this article. It's quite easy to read, and I think it's a quite important article to know. So now, one of the points of Garrett Hardin was also to suggest some ways to fight this stock. So it's a tragedy. It seems that it's quite inevitable when you have this condition of a resource that is limited and free access to the resource. And so what Garrett Hardin suggested is to actually put some measures, coercive measures, to avoid the tragedy of the common. One of them is basically to restrict the access to the commons, or to restrict the access to resources, to make sure that you never go over the carrying capacity. And so it suggests different ways to do that. You can do a lottery, for example. So you just randomly draw the individual who can have access to the commons, or you can attribute them a score based on their previous use of the resources, for example, and the more meritant individual get access to the resources, the other one don't get access. Or you can just give the rule that the first come is the first served, and when you reach carrying capacity, you stop the access to the resources. So this is one way where you can avoid this kind of tragedy of the commons. Another way is to artificially inflate the costs for the individual who use the commons, because one of the key aspects of the tragedy of the commons is that the benefit is for the individual when using the resource. The benefit is directly for the individual, but the cost is shared by all individuals who use the resources. And so that's why the cost is so low. And so what you can do is to artificially inflate the cost for the individual. So this is, for example, the case when you add a tax to enter access to the commons, or when you add a tax on the benefit that are extracted from the exploitation of the common. So by using this tax, this artificial inflation of the cost, you can also limit the evolution of the tragedy of the commons. And there was a third way that was actually not really discussed by Hardin, but that was more studied in non-human society, let's say, is cooperation. And so cooperation, it relies on the fact that the individuals that use the resources will self-organize, and they will selfly implement a way to use the resources that is sustainable. So they will decide whether an additional player can enter in the game, what's the level of resources that they want to attribute to everyone, and they will self-limit their uptake of the resources, for example. Of course, these systems are very unstable because they can be easily invaded by cheaters. When you arrive in a pasture that is well managed by many farmers, it's very easy for you to put additional cows and to not respect the rules of the land. You see this very green pasture that is very highly well managed over generations. So it's a situation that is very easily corrupted, actually. And so we know in nature that cooperation, this self-organization of individual, it can be stabilized and it can evolve and it can be maintained in the population without being invaded by cheaters. And there is actually 3 different possibilities that have been studied, proposed, and demonstrated in natural animal societies where cooperation can actually be maintained over many generations. And the first type of cooperation that is evolutionary stable or can be evolutionary stable is when the fact to cooperate brings you a direct benefit. So, for example, you have these social beaver in Africa that build collective nests. And so there is a cost to build the nest. It's highly costly to go and find the material to build the nest, but then the nest will be shared by everyone. And so by building this collective nest, you also build your own nest. And so this is really a kind of behavior that is costly, but brings you a direct benefit because you will go and live in this structure that is built by many individuals. Another example is collective hunting in carnivorous animals, where by hunting prey as a group, you have more success to find a prey, and you will directly benefit from having a prey because you will share the prey among the different hunters. Another situation is when the cooperation is preferentially directed to individuals who can reciprocate the cooperation. And so it means that individuals have, for example, the ability to remember if in a previous interaction with you, you cooperate with them. And if they can remember this information reliably, they will cooperate with you because they know that maybe in the future, they will be able to benefit again from cooperative action from you. And so this kind of cooperation has been highly debated in the literature in evolutionary biology because it relies on very often on the capacity of the individual to have a memory and to remember the outcome of previous interaction. And so it is thought now, it is believed that most of these cooperative behaviors are only found in humans because we have this capacity to remember for a long time and with a high degree of certitude whether an individual cooperated or not. And finally, the third way in which cooperation can evolve, and so you can avoid these kind of tragedies and seek for individual benefit at the expense of collective success. The last mechanism is called kin selection. I don't know if it has been introduced to you already in the previous lectures, but kin selection is an evolutionary theory that was developed by William Hamilton in 1964, so really close to the Hardin paper on the tragedy of the commons. And this guy, Hamilton, he was an evolutionary biologist and he was highly interested in asocial insects like bees and ants. And he was puzzled by the fact that in those insects, as you may know, a very high proportion of the individuals in a group, in a colony, they do not reproduce at all. They spend their life taking care of other individuals and they do not reproduce themselves. So for example, in bees, you know that there is a queen in the colony. The queen lay eggs, and those eggs are taken care by the workers in the colony. And the workers, they are sterile. They never reproduce actually. So they have a reproductive output, which is 0. And so it was really puzzling for Hamilton to explain how this behavior can be maintained by natural selection, because until then, Darwinian selection and the Darwinian theory of natural selection was that the traits that spread in a population are the ones that brings a benefit to the individual and that makes them have more springs than their other conspecifics. And in this case, in the bee example, you have some individuals that do not reproduce at all, so they cannot pass their genes to the next generation, but still at each generation, you have some newborn workers that are there and that are maintained in the population. And so Hamilton showed that this behavior evolved and could be stabilized because there was a high relatedness between the workers and the eggs that are laid by the queen. And so it just explained the fact that by helping a close relative to reproduce, you receive an indirect fitness benefit. So I don't know if you heard about the concept of fitness, but it's a key concept in evolutionary biology that measure your evolutionary success. So fitness is generally defined as the number of offspring that you will have that will fully develop into mature individual in the next generation. So it's basically your number of successful offspring. And so when you help a relative to reproduce, you have an indirect benefit because you pass the genes of your relative to the next generation. You help your relative passing his own genes to the next generation. And because this guy is related to you, indirectly, you pass your own genes to the next generation. You pass them not through your own body, but through the body of another individual that is related to you. And so Hamilton formalized some theory. I did not put here all the equation and the mathematical theory, but it's a population genetic theory where you have some parameters like relatedness, the cost of a phenotype, and the benefit that it brings to another individual. And basically, Hamilton showed that depending on the value of those parameters, if relatedness particularly is very high, you can stabilize cooperation between individuals because they direct their cooperative behavior preferentially towards relatives. And so since then, since this formalization of kin selection, many examples of behavior have been explained by kin selection. It has really been a very successful theory in evolutionary biology. For some people, as important as the Darwinian initial theory of natural selection. And so from a social insect in the beginning, many animal behavior were revisited with this kin selection theory. For example, you have these building ground squirrels that scream when they see a predator approaching. It's quite, you may seem at first glance that it's quite stupid to do that because when you scream, the predator can see you and can spot you and can come and just eat you. So it's very costly behavior. It was also very hard to explain why the individual were doing that. And they just realized that those ground squirrels, they do the calls more often when they are surrounded by the high proportion of relatives. And if you die yourself, but you help two individuals that have half of your gene to survive, for example, your sisters or your brother, in the end, from the point of view of the gene, the outcome is the same. So you can die if you manage to save two sisters or two brothers. And so that's kin selection explained this kind of behavior in animals. And so this was just theory and observation, but one of the most convincing experiments that kin selection worked and could explain the evolution of cooperation was produced in a microorganism, and most particularly in Pseudomonas aeruginosa, which is a bacteria that causes cystic fibrosis in humans. And we know that these bacteria, like many bacteria, they need iron to grow and to reproduce and to make their metabolism. But very often iron, especially in the ferric form in the environment, so as a 3+ form, it is not immediately available for the bacteria. They cannot absorb it in this form. And so the bacteria have evolved a mechanism that is able to scavenge the iron from their environment, and then they are able to absorb iron when it forms a complex with these molecules. And so in Pseudomonas aeruginosa, one of the molecules that has been really studied is purverdin. So we know that these bacteria can produce purverdin, and purverdin form a complex with iron. And then the Pseudomonas can use this iron purverdin complex. And pyroverdine can be considered as a common and pyroverdine production as a cooperative phenotype because actually when a bacteria produces the pyroverdine, it just produces the pyroverdine all around the bacterial cell. And so all the individuals in the locality, they can benefit from this pyroverdine iron complex. And we know that it's metabolically costly to produce the complex because the individuals that are not able to produce pyroverdine, they usually outgrow and outcompete the pyroverdine producing strain in the lab. So it's a compound that is costly to produce and that benefits all the individuals in the surrounding. So the prediction of the tragedy of the common for this particular system was that the cheaters that do not engage into pyroverdine production, they would just invade the natural population because they benefit from the pyroverdine produced by cooperators without paying the cost of pyroverdine production. So the prediction of the tragedy of the common is that those strains should invade the population. But the researcher, when they look at this particular Pseudomonas in human bodies, in cell tissues, or in the living environment, they only find very few mutants that do not produce pyroverdine. And it's very striking because you would expect them to be in high frequency because they can survive without paying the cost of pyroverdine production. And so one of the questions that emerge is that how cooperation for pyroverdine production can be maintained in this particular organism. And there was a very important experiment published in 2004 in Nature that really demonstrated the principle of kin selection in this system by actually showing the occurrence of kin selection over generations. And so again, you have this paper attached to the course material. I highly recommend you to read it. It's quite easy to understand. It's a simple experiment. It's one of those very beautiful and elegant scientific results that was just necessary to show that the theory was working and very simple to do actually. So what they did, you can see in those tubes, you have different bacteria. In the dark green tubes, it's the bacteria that can produce the pyroverdine. In white, it's the tubes with bacteria that cannot produce the pyroverdine. And you have 4 different selection schemes. So if I go on the one that is totally on the left side, I don't know if I can have a pointer. I will try to point here. It's probably here. Okay. So the one that is on the left side, totally on the left side, you have those different tubes with one colony on one genotype, let's say per tube, either pyroverdine producing or not pyroverdine producing. And then what they do is they plate the tubes on petri dishes. They let the bacteria grow in individual colonies, and then for each plate they sample one colony and they regenerate a tube in the next generation. So the tube is just the environment where the bacteria grow, and the plate is just a way to see them and to count the colony. And so in the first kind of selection on the left, you have those individual tubes. They are plated, and then they sample one colony, and they make a whole tube from that colony, and they replate the tube, and they redo a colony, etc., for many, many generations. On the second one, on the left, what they do is instead of plating the tube individually, they just pull all the tube together. They do a mix, and then they plate this mix on a single petri dishes. And from this single petri dish, they re-inoculate different tubes with one colony per tube again. So this treatment is called high relatedness because in all the tubes, you always have a single clone, a single colony and a single clone. And then you have 2 levels of competition, local competition on the left and a global competition on the right. Local competition means that when they sample the colonies, they only sample colonies among a plate that was generated from a single tube. So the bacteria strains are only in competition within tube and not between tubes because you will always sample all the tubes at equal frequency. So the researchers always sample one colony per tube from one generation to the next. Whereas on the right side, the one called global competition, because you put all the tube together and you sample a small number of colonies from this pool, the tubes are in competition between them. So the tubes that produce more bacteria at the tube level, they will have a higher representation in the Petri dishes. They will be more represented. So that's what they call that global competition, because the bacteria are in competition between tubes, whereas in the first case, they are only in competition within tubes. And so on the totally right part of this scheme, it's exactly the same global and local competition, but this time you have 2 clones per tube. So you start the experiment, instead of starting the experiment with tubes with only the pure verdin producer or only the non-producer, they do a 50% mix of both. And so that's why you have the light green color. And then they also, again, they either plate the tube individually or they mix the tube and plate them together, and they sample the colonies in both cases, and they go to the next generation. And here the difference is that instead of sampling one colony for one tube in the next generation, they sample 2 colonies, and they always mix 2 colonies in the tube for the next generation. So in some cases, you end up with a white tube because they sample 2 colonies that are from a non-pure verdin producer. In some cases, you have the dark green tube because they sample 2 colonies that are from the pure verdin producers. And in some cases, you have this light green color because the 2 colonies that they sampled are the 2 different genotypes. And so here is the outcome of the experiment. So the advantage of microorganisms is that you can do many, many generations over a short amount of time. So here I think they had in total 40 or 50 generations. You have the exact information in the paper. And they sampled the plate at different time points over the course of the experiment. And what you see on the y-axis is the proportion of cooperator in the population of tubes. So they always started with 50% of cooperators, either when they were alone in their tube, it was 50% of the tubes, or when they were mixed with the other non-pure verdin producers, they always started with 50%. And you can see that in some of those selection scenarios, the cooperators, so the one that produce pure verdin, they completely disappeared at the end of the experiment. So that's a typical tragedy of the commons. They were invaded by the cheaters, the one that do not produce a pure verdin. And so actually what you don't see here in this plot is that this population were very poorly productive, because when you just have the cheaters, they cannot absorb iron anymore. So that's why it's a tragedy of the commons, because the cheaters by themselves, they are very poor. They cannot really survive. And so on this graph, what you can see is that the cooperators, the one that produce pure verdin, they can be either maintained at 50% in some scenario, or they can actually invade the population and be stable at very high frequency, as what we see in natural populations. And it is only the case when you have high relatedness, so R, the little R letter. So the high relatedness is the scenario where they only sampled one colony from one generation to the other, instead of low relatedness when they sampled 2 colonies and they put them in the same tube. So they had to have high relatedness and global competition, meaning competition between tubes. And this scenario works to select the cooperative behavior, because cooperation can evolve only when relatedness is high, which is predicted by kin selection, and when competition is global, because it means that when competition is global, the tubes that produce more bacteria, they were more represented as the next generation. And so it means that selection occurred at the group level and not at the individual level within a group. And so that was the 2 important results of this experiment, showing the importance of relatedness and showing the importance of the scale of competition, whether it's local or global. So if it's not clear, you can, again, interrupt me and ask questions. You also have the paper to go into more detail in the experiment. They have more tubes than just the 4 tubes that are shown in this figure, which is just an illustrative figure. And they explain very well in the paper how they do the selection of colonies and the re-plating on the Petri dishes, etc. So After all this, you might wonder why I'm not speaking about plants and crops, because that's the topic of the summer school. Actually, you can really easily picture the tragedy of the commons occurring in crops, because crops are typically grown as a group of individuals at very high density, competing for a limited set of resources, for example, water, nutrients, or light. And so if you imagine a situation where you have a mixture of different crops, different species, or even different genotypes of the same species. So in this case, in my little drawing here, you have two different varieties of wheat. If you have a very high competitor and a very weak competitor, you expect over generation to lose the weak competitor and to only have the high competitor that invades the population. And so in this scenario, we know that grain yield will most likely decrease, because at the end of the game, at the end of the generation, you have plants that are very tall, that produce a lot of vegetative tissues and not so much grains. And the competition intensity between plants is very high. They shade each other, they compete a lot for soil resources. And so the yield actually decreases. And actually, this was observed quite a long time ago by agronomists, again, in those same years of the 60s, the end of the 60s. Here you have some experiments that were done by rice breeders at IRRI in the Philippines. It's one of the leading world center for rice breeding including nowadays. And so back in those days, they were interested in mixing different varieties together in the field and let the mixture of variety evolve on its own over generations. And so they mixed 5 different rice varieties at 20% each. So an equi-mix of the different varieties. And on the left plot, what you can see is the productivity of the different varieties. So you have TN1, which is the most productive variety, and BG, which is the less productive variety. And what you can see is that over just 4 years, they completely lost TN1 and the other 3 varieties. And only BG is present in the mixture at nearly 100%. So it's only the less productive varieties that were selected over generation. And in the paper, so this one you don't have because it's quite long and not very easy to read paper. There is no graph or tables. I made the graph out of the paper, but you can see in the paper that BG is a very tall variety with many stems, a very wide leaf, and so it's a variety that is highly competitive. But actually, when you grow a lot of those BG plants close together, they just have a very high intensity of competition, and that's why you have in a monoculture of BG a very low yield. And so Donald is an agronomist, an Australian agronomist, which was very famous for pointing at this problem, from being the first to point at this problem. So he was kind of already applying the concept of the tragedy of the commons in crops without naming it as a tragedy of the commons. But he was the first one to say that while competitive ability is interesting and it can be advantageous against other species such as weeds, in a monoculture it will lead to heavy competition and heavy mutual depression among the crowded plants. And so it was really a new idea back in those days, because the breeders were mostly interested in selecting the most beautiful looking plants. So they would focus on the very tall and very bushy and very big plants. And Donald, basically, they told them in this famous paper, you have to select for very, very weak individuals, very small plants with a single stem, very small leaves, and actually plants that at the individual level, they produce far less grain than they could produce if they were bigger at the individual level. But at the group level, those plants are very interesting because you can put a lot of them per square meter and they will not outcompete each other. And so this is how you will maximize productivity. And this is just an illustration of cooperation, because you want to have a monoculture of plants that express a phenotype that is not optimal for them, but that is optimal for the group. And so since Donald's idea, many authors in ecology, agronomy, evolutionary biology, they have revisited the concept of tragedy of the commons and applied it to different crop traits. And so in this a very nice review that is also attached to my course by Anton and Vermeulen in 2016. You have a compilation of all the crop traits that have been shown to evolve as a tragedy of the commons, mostly in theoretical models, because it's not so easy to have experiments over many generations where you have measurements on the different crop traits. And so in this table, I'm not going to go through all the entries in the table, but there is different traits for which a model in the game theory literature or in the evolutionary biology literature, the trait has been shown to evolve towards a value that is a tragedy of the common, meaning that towards a value that decrease population yield overall. So for example, a very famous example is plant height, where you know that the optimal height in a crop is often to be not so tall, but in most models, when you let a population of plant evolve, the plants become taller and taller. Shorter plants, they avoid the excessive cost of supports and opportunity costs such as lower defense, but in such population, taller individuals gain advantage by capturing more of the available light. And so you can see that you can really replicate this reasoning for all traits that relate to resource acquisition. For example, leaf area. You know that the optimal leaf area would be thinner leaves, but if you leave a population free to evolve, in a lot of models, you will see that the plant evolve wider leaves to outcompete their neighbor to a point where all the plants have wide leaves and they shade each other a lot. And so you have a tragedy of the commons. It's not only about biomass and growth, it's also competition for other resources, such as pollinators, for example. We know that plants that produce bigger floral display, they will attract a greater share of pollinators for themselves. And so if pollinators are limiting, it's a limiting resources, these bigger pollinator attractions will just divert pollinators from the other plants. And so this is another example where you can have a tragedy of the commons. But again, I'm not going to go through all the traits. I will give you the opportunity on your spare time to go and also check this article, which is quite easy to read, and you have many inspiring ideas on tragedy of the commons and how they can shape crop phenotypes and go in wrong direction, actually, if you want to maximize group productivity. I just want to tell you that actually you can demonstrate that the same experiment that was been done in microorganism with pioverdin, you can use the same principles of kin selection and global competition to show that you can avoid the tragedy of the commons in plants. And so we published this results in 2020 using a theoretical model again, in which we investigated the evolution of plant height. And we hypothesized again that the taller plants were the most selfish and the shorter plants were more cooperative, because you had a relationship between height and yield that was a bell-shaped relationship. When you are too short, it's not very good to produce seeds because you are too short to have enough photosynthetic surface and get enough carbohydrates from photosynthesis to make a lot of grains. When you are too tall, you have the risk to lodge and to fail before the end of the cycle. And you also attribute a lot of resources to the stem and to the leaf and not so much to the grain. And so the optimal phenotype is somewhere in the middle at the individual level. But at the group level, the optimal phenotype is actually to be shorter because you reduce competition. And so we built a model with different selection scheme, just as the one that were presented with a tube. We really just used the same ideas, but instead of bacterial tubes, we assumed that we were using different fields. And so it was just like if a farmer had different fields, and he was just interested in harvesting the field and resowing them in the next generation without measuring plant height at any point. And so we just modelized 3 different selection strategies. The one that is on the left, each field is harvested separately and resown with the harvest of the same field in the next generation. So there is no seed exchange between the different fields. Another way to say it is that competition is purely local, because when you sample a seed in the harvest, for example, of the blue field, this seed has not been in competition with the harvest of the yellow field or the green field, because you will sample an equal number of seeds in all the fields, no matter their productivity. In the scenario in the middle, we would just pull the harvest of all 3 fields together before sampling the seed for the next generation. And on the right side, so on the middle scheme, you just have the global competition equivalent of the bacterial experiment I showed you before, where they plated all the tube together. In our case, we just harvest the field all together and pull the harvest as a single harvested bag in this case. And on the right breeding scheme, it's an extreme version of the global competition, where you immediately eliminate the fields that have the lowest productivity, and you only keep the most productive field. So the competition is global at the scale of the field, but you do not even sample any seeds from the field that are not the most productive one. You only sample the seeds from the most productive field. And what we could show with this model is that we could maintain actually very short plants that were the one that optimized grain yield and that were below the optimal plant height for an individual plant. In the 2 scenarios on the right, whereas in the first scenario on the left, where competition is purely local, we always had a tragedy of the commons with plants evolving taller and taller, and plants engaging in an arms race for light competition, leading to very low grain yield. And one last point that I did not mention is that in the model, of course, we were able to manipulate relatedness, which is a key parameter of kin selection. And we would manipulate kin selection and relatedness by controlling the number of seeds we were sampling in the harvest for the next generation. So when you want to have 300 seeds, you can either directly sample 300 seeds, in which case you have a very high chance that they will not be related with each other, or you can sample just 1 seed, which is 1 genotype, and artificially you multiply this seed to reach 300 seeds. And so it's like if you clone the seed, you make sure that all the 300 seeds that are produced from this single seed, they have the same genotype, the same DNA, and so they are clones. And so in this case, you have a very high relatedness. And so in the model, we showed that you could avoid the tragedy of the commons and maintain short plants when you have global competition and high relatedness, just as it was shown empirically in bacteria. And so in this summer school, one of the core exercise that you will have to do, which I think is quite very interesting for you, is to try to assess if another type of traits that has never been considered in the literature as cooperative traits or as potentially being involved in a tragedy of the common is actually involved in a tragedy of the common, or could be involved in a tragedy of the common. So we know that plants from the dicotyledon families, they also rely on a mechanism to absorb iron. They need iron for their metabolism, and they also cannot use iron directly from the environment. So they have to produce some chelates, some molecules that have to first trap iron, and then they can absorb the complexes. And so, for example, Arabidopsis thaliana, it uses the model plant species that we use, in the lab for genetics. We know that these plants has to produce coumarins, especially in a high pH environment, in quite basic environment. Arabidopsis thaliana rely on coumarin production to absorb iron. But we don't know if producing this coumarin is costly, and we don't know if the neighboring plant can benefit from the iron coumarin complex for their own growth. And so the aim of your practicals and the aim of the exercise you will have in the summer school is to determine whether there is a cost to produce the coumarin, whether the coumarin provide a benefit to the neighboring plants, and whether coumarin production can be maintained in natural population and how it can be maintained. So you will mostly address the 2 first questions, especially with the practicals that you will do. So you will have some experiments ready for you to analyze with Arabidopsis thaliana. And the last question is more an open question that you will have to think about at the end of the summer school. But that's really the research topic that you will focus on during the summer school. It's directly related to this tragedy of the commons and cooperation. Here I've just listed the main articles that we went through the presentation, and it's also the articles that are attached to my course on Moodle. Again, I highly encourage you to read them. If you have to, maybe it's a lot of articles, so if you have to prioritize them, I highly recommend The Tragedy of the Commons by Hardin, Anton and Vermeulen, Tragedies and Crops is also very relevant for the summer school and quite easy to read. And maybe the Buckling paper, siderophore-mediated cooperation in Pseudomonas. It's not the original Nature paper, but maybe it's more easy to understand than the Nature paper. The Nature paper is okay, you can also read it, but maybe the Buckling paper is more accessible for you to read. And that's all for me for today. I don't know if you already have questions, or we also have a session next week, I think, for questions, to give you some time to read the articles. But if you already have some questions now, I'm happy to answer.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, I have a question regarding, because last time we talked about participatory plant breeding with a high diverse background. And like, what do you think about that in terms of Tragedy of the Commons, and where will selection go if the selection is going to be on the farm with these high diversity panels?
So what we expect and what they observe very often, but actually that would be very interesting to discuss with Isabelle Goldranger if you see her in a Q&A session. But they tend to observe this increase in plant height over generation. And so this Tragedy of the Common, because the way they do the selection very often is mass selection. So when they do mass selection, they go in the field and they sample the most beautiful plants, and they sample a lot of spikes from different plants. They mix them together. So when they do that, they have low relatedness because they go through multiple genotype, multiple varieties, and they have local competition because they do the selection within the field. Sometimes they select from the seed lots after it's been harvested. And so it's a random sample in the seed lots, but generally what they have is this increase in plant height. But you know, things are not so clear because sometimes they will tell you that they also want the plants to be tall because they use it in the traditional systems. They are also interested to have chaff for the animals, for example. So they also want to have this biomass for other uses. So it's not like they are fully, it's not a detrimental point for them to have these tall plants. Sometimes they are happy to actually have tall plants, but I would say that generally they go against this selection for more for shorter plants. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Everything was crystal clear, apparently.
Maybe I can add a comment if there is no other questions. Or can you hear me? I don't know.
Yes.
Thank you very much. It was so very nice and very clear. So concerning your remark, Lucas, actually what Isabelle Goldranger does when she discusses with the farmers, because she's completely aware about this mechanism, she knows that the competition will increase the plant tallness. And she makes the farmers aware that they have to be very careful by the practical of breeding. So sometimes when we were on the platform, a farmer made the experiment to select the short plants and the tall plants from the same bulk at the beginning. And what he obtained was a shorter variety and a higher variety. And he was able to show that the difference in yield, in grain yield, was about 1 ton. No, what was it, 1 ton? Or yes, it was, no, yes, 1 ton. So you see, so depending on what you do want to do with the energy of the plant, either you want the chaff or the straw for your animals, or you want also to have a service against weeds also, because the farmers that do that
Yes.
very often they are organic farmers, and tall plants are also more adapted to competition with weeds also.
Yeah.
So in this
Exactly.
case, it is not a strategy of commons. It could be something different.
Yeah, it was like you had this citation by Donald. Strong competitive ability is advantageous against species such as weeds. So it's true that some farmers, they also look for this competitiveness against weeds.
But if I may add, and maybe Germain could comment, actually the way that Germain presented you the different possibility of selecting against strategy of common, to my knowledge, it is not yet put into work into farmers' networks. I don't know if Germain, you have any.
You mean the selection scheme?
Yes.
These ones, for example? No. It's been
every farmer makes the selection on the left.
Yes.
But sometimes they exchange seeds, and they make I would say some mixing, and maybe sometimes they can also be on the right side if they exchange seeds. Possibly they will exchange the most productive ones. So it's a quite complex question.
Yeah.
I was expecting some of you having questions about Arabidopsis.
Yet, right? Did you already had the lecture on iron nutrition in plants? No?
On the different ways that iron is used by plants. But it will be a physiological lecture.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, Germain, can you tell them when will be your
Yes, it's
question and answer session?
It's next week at the same time, same place, same time next week. So it's the 4th of July at 2.
So to be efficient on this session, could you please read the paper that Germain sent you? We will put online also this lesson. So we apologize because we may have missed the first minutes of your intervention, Germain. So we are very desperate about this.
No problem.
Not a problem for you, but no, possibly for the people who are not there. So please send us the questions before. So we have put in place a forum within the German's lecture. So please put your question there. So either people you can exchange ideas between yourselves, and Germain could have a look on the question and prepare his answer for the next session. So please use it accordingly. Is that clear? Could you make a sign that everything is clear? At least we have 2 people online.
Yes.
Okay, great.
They are shy.
Before coming here.
Yes.
So I am really grateful, Germain, for your participation. So thank you very much again. And so we can make some applause.
Okay, see you all next week, and then in Montpellier in July.